As humans, we all share some common experiences, no matter what part of the world we live in, and no matter what our culture may be. We share them because we are human. Some are obvious. We are all born. We all gather sustenance in some way. We all sleep, we all dream, we all love and hate, and we all die. These are things we understand. However, there are other experiences we share that are not so easily understood, such as dreams, sleep paralysis, and the old hag. The old hag occurs everywhere in every human culture. It is sometimes called an experience, sometimes a phenomenon, but it is sometimes, in fact, often called an attack, and for good reason, because it is often utterly terrifying. So what is it? Well, let's take a look, but please don't doze off, because something might be waiting for you. What is the old hag? The old hag phenomenon, experience, or attack is a constellation of separate elements. Central to this suite of elements is sleep paralysis, also known as nocturnal paralysis, sleep numbness, and post-dormital cholastic fits. They all mean the same thing: sleep-associated paralysis. A key element to the experience of sleep paralysis is the feeling of being completely awake, but unable to move any part of the body, with the exception of the eyelids and eyes. No other part of the body responds to the attempt at voluntary movement. It typically lasts only a few seconds, but can last up to several minutes. Sleep paralysis was once thought to be extremely rare and associated with narcolepsy, but is now known to be quite common, with estimates of its occurrence ranging from 20% to 60% of the world's population. Typically, a person may experience 1 or 2 episodes in a lifetime, but some people can experience regular episodes at intervals of days, weeks, or months, and very few can experience them almost every night for varying periods of time. The crucial element to the old hag experience which sets it apart from simple sleep paralysis is the acute awareness, sometimes accompanied by a visual experience, of some sort of presence in the room with the sleeper. This may include the sensation of an entity standing over the experiencer, or the sensation of the bed being depressed by the weight of something sitting or lying on it. This presence may be strongly sensed and felt, but not seen, or may typically manifest as a dark shadow, a dark mist, or a human shape with no defining features, except occasionally for intensely dark eyes, darker than the entity itself. There may also be the tactile sensation of being touched, prodded, or even pinched. Most importantly, and central to the experience, the sleeper may feel a heavy weight on their body, typically on the chest, but sometimes on the legs, and sometimes the sensation of being strangled. The sense of wakeful paralysis coupled with the weight pressing on the body is a classic old hag attack. The experience is almost invariably terrifying, and in fact, is the source of the concept of the nightmare, a word derived from the Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon mara, which may have originally meant night death or something similar. Nightmares were not just bad dreams, as the term is used today, nor were they night terrors. These are different phenomena. Instead, they were regarded as some sort of supernatural assault, sometimes as a result of being cursed or bewitched. How widespread is the experience? The old hag has equivalents in virtually every culture in which the phenomenon has been studied. It is well known, for instance, in Canada's Newfoundland, where it is a part of the cultural tradition, and has been studied extensively in Japan, where it is called kanashibari, or bound up with metal. It has also been documented across the United States, Europe, throughout Asia, and among the various indigenous groups of the far north, the Inuit, Yupik, and Aleut. In the United States, which contains a number of subcultures, the pattern is the same. Sleep paralysis is usually but not always hypnopompic, the presence of an unknown and unwelcome entity, and the feeling of physical oppression. It is a universal human experience, which I think you'll agree is terrifying. But what causes it? There are a couple of perhaps incidental things to mention here at the outset. These are things that concern the immediate causal factors that may be involved. First, for some unknown reason, it tends to be more common among people who sleep on their backs. Sleeping on one side would presumably make it more difficult to experience the sensation of crushing weight on the chest, yet the experience is not, as a rule, associated with sleeping on one's stomach, which presumably would allow such a sensation. But this does not appear to be the case. Second, although it can happen at any time, and is most associated with nighttime sleep, there are quite a few accounts of the experience occurring to people who nap during the day, especially in the late morning. Why this is unknown, but it may be associated with the next point. Third, people who are chronically fatigued, sleep-deprived and stressed seem particularly prone to such experiences. They may be late-night workers, chronically fatigued and stressed students, and others in similar condition. All of this suggests a physiological component to the experience, which is not unexpected since we experience everything, regardless of their natures and origins, through physiological processes. The fact that the phenomenon is particularly associated with some degree of sleep deprivation would suggest that there is a component of disruption of normal sleep cycle involved. This is an important point because the experience is strongly associated with certain stages of the sleep cycle. The subjective experience. The subjective experience is generally a profound terror, although on very rare occasions, when the experience is frequent, the subject may actually relax and even welcome it, although this is very rare. The initial paralysis is generally at first confusing and frightening. The fear is exacerbated by the sense of an additional, unknown and foreign and intrusive presence. Figures may be perceived, usually dark, but on rare occasions luminous. The paralysis itself may dissipate spontaneously, but as modern research into sleep paralysis has shown, moving even just a finger or toe is typically enough to end the paralysis, and coincidentally also the visitation of these presences. The most frightening are the visions of dark entities hovering over the bed of the subject, standing around the bed, or sitting or lying on the bed with the subject, and this is always accompanied by a feeling of helplessness. In these cases, the main source of fear is proximity and paralytic helplessness, since the nature of this entity is unknown. Not everyone finds this experience threatening, and some people may even strike out, but most do not, sometimes out of fear, and sometimes as a result of sleep paralysis. Those who strike at the entity, or even manage to turn on a light, find that it dissipates, and this suggests that it is a sleep-related hallucination or dreamlike phenomenon. Again, numerous accounts indicate that regaining the ability to move, even one digit suffices to break the paralysis, and the general experience of an intruding entity. So, is the experience real? The question is, are people who are subject to an old hag attack in fact being attacked by an actual, objectively existing entity? The study of the old hag phenomenon was given its first rigorous systematic treatment by Dr. David J. Hufford, originally a folklorist and now retired from the University of Pennsylvania, where he held positions as a university professor and chair of medical humanities and professor of neural and behavioral science. Hufford became interested in the old hag phenomenon after his own encounter with it in the 1970s. In 1982, after some years of field research, he published what has become a classic in the field, The Terror That Comes in the Night, in which he distinguished between what he called the cultural source hypothesis and the experiential source hypothesis. This was the culmination of his investigation into numerous hag attacks, ranging from archived historical records to extensive interviews with people who had experienced them. It was a way to disentangle old hag experiences that were preconditioned by cultural elements and expectations, from experiences that occurred to people without any prior knowledge or predisposition to them. This was considerably easier in the 1970s, before the advent of the internet, than it would be now. What he found was that culture did not determine who experienced an old hag attack. In all the cases he studied, the event followed the same basic outline, of course with minor variations, whether or not the subject had any familiarity with the experience. This in turn indicated that cultural expectations do not influence this experience, and so believing in the reality of certain paranormal beliefs, such as an entity like the old hag, is, as Hufford puts it, reasonable, because such encounters aren't the result of any obvious cultural or attitudinal leanings, but nonetheless have experiential elements. This doesn't mean that they are true, but merely that it is reasonable and sensible to believe them, based on the available evidence. Given this, what the hell is happening? What is certainly happening is hypnopompic, and less often, hypnagogic sleep paralysis, accompanied by a clear sense of being fully awake, which is to be expected. What is also certainly happening is the strong sense, whether seen or only felt, of a strange, anomalous, often threatening, unexplainable presence. This is not culturally determined because it happens to people across many cultures, both within one country and also worldwide, and all cultures have words or phrases for the experience. Hypnopompic sleep paralysis typically occurs during the REM, or rapid eye movement portion of the sleep cycle. The REM cycle is essentially the dream portion of our sleep. And so what appears to be happening is that sleepers awaken while in a dream state, but may still incorporate dream elements into this waking state. And as noted, they will experience sleep paralysis for periods ranging from seconds to several minutes. What is odd, however, and cannot be explained by science, is why people from all over the world experience the exact same thing. One might expect that experiencing a waking dream could take an endless variety of forms, yet the Mara or old hag recurs again and again in all cultures. Why is that? Perhaps we have those same experiences because we live in the same world, a world we do not fully understand, and there are things out there that we have still not been able to get to grips with. Dreams may be a vehicle to another world. This seems, on the face of it, to be highly unlikely, although following Hufford, not unreasonable. It's just implausible because evidence is lacking. But we have evidence for what's happening in the brain during these episodes. The most reasonable, and probably at present correct position to take, is that we still have barely begun to understand the human brain and mind. The mind is an amazing machine. There is recent evidence that certain neurons, called LP5 neurons, act as mediators between other types of neurons to create consciousness. This is significant because we still don't understand consciousness or self. We do know that the brain is capable of astonishing things, although oftentimes we don't know how. So is sleep paralysis and a visitation by the hag a universal trait that all of us hold within our brain? One thing that could tip this uncertainty one way or the other would be evidence of physical harm, perhaps in the form of bruises that could not be self-inflicted, since this would constitute evidence of an external agent. And this is where we call upon all of our viewers. If any of you have ever had a visitation by the hag and feel comfortable sharing your story with us, please send us a story to mystory@top5s.co.uk. If you have any physical evidence of attacks and feel comfortable sharing this, we'd also love to hear from you. We still don't know what the old hag is. Does she break through the barrier during sleep, or is there a more scientific and plausible explanation? As of yet, we simply do not know. Regardless, thanks for watching, and sweet dreams. Some mysteries will never be solved. However, most are eventually. And with the advancements in DNA analysis and other scientific techniques, even the most baffling cases are finally being cracked. In this video, we will look at 5 chilling cases that have finally been resolved. So join us as we unravel the truth behind some of the most enigmatic cases out there, from a 30-year-old murder to an enduring identity case that lingered on for over 70 years. The Solway Spaceman. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, the world was captivated by the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And when in 1962, NASA released a photo showing astronauts in their official space gear, the image of the spaceman was born. In 1964, on a beautiful sunny day, Jim Templeton, a fireman from Carlisle in the UK, photographed his daughter in her new dress. After getting the photos developed, one of the shots showed what appeared to be a spaceman lurking in the background. Alarmed by what he saw, Mr. Templeton took the photo to the police in Carlisle, who were uninterested in the anomaly. However, the image gained public interest after being released to the local press. Kodak also got involved and even rewarded anyone who could prove the photo was fake, a reward that was never claimed. Eventually the photo went global and became known as the Solway Spaceman. Things got even more intriguing after Jim Templeton revealed that he had a visit from the mysterious men in black, who asked him to take them to the spot overlooking the Solway Firth where the image had been captured. The two men referred to each other as number 9 and number 11. There was never any question that the photo was fake or had been tampered with in any way, and speculation was rife about just who or what was standing behind the little girl. It took over 50 years to solve the mystery finally. With the advancement of technology, several experts have revisited the image and have come to the following conclusion. On that day in May 1964, Jim Templeton and his daughter were not the only ones present. His wife Annie was also there, and in the shot before the one featuring the spaceman, you can see her playing on the floor beside her daughter. She is wearing a pale blue sleeveless dress. Templeton took 3 photos of his daughter in quick succession using a Kodak camera, and it was the middle one that showed the supposed spaceman. It is now concluded that the spaceman illusion was created by Annie Templeton, who inadvertently walked into the shot, unseen by her husband through the viewfinder of his Pentacon FSLR camera that only gave him a 70% view. This theory is backed up by the other photo taken that day that shows his wife, again, caught in Templeton's blind spot. The overexposed image in the Solway spaceman photo makes Annie's dress appear white, and looking at the position of her arm, it appears to be the back of her walking out of the shot. So although Mr. Templeton was telling the truth about what happened that day, he wouldn't have seen his wife through the viewfinder, and the photograph wasn't manipulated, faked, or set up in any way. There was, after all, a simple explanation. As for the men in black who visited Templeton, unless he was lying about it, that part of this mystery is still unsolved. The Somerton Man. On the 1st of December 1948, beachgoers found the body of a man leaning against a wall on the beach at Somerton Park, Adelaide, Australia. The smartly dressed man wore a suit and tie and appeared to be around 40-50 years old. In his pocket were bus and train tickets, chewing gum, matches, 2 combs and a pack of cigarettes. Resting on his shirt collar was a half-smoked cigarette. Investigators later discovered the tags on his clothes had been cut off. In his trousers pocket, they found a scrap of paper torn from the final page of a copy of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, authored by 12th century poet Omar Khayyam. The Persian phrase tamam shud was printed on the paper, meaning it is over or it is finished. Following a public appeal by the police, the book from which the page had been torn was located. On the inside back cover, detectives read through indentations left from previous handwriting and revealed a local telephone number, another unidentified number, and text that resembled a coded message. To this day, the text has yet to be deciphered or interpreted. 6 weeks after the body was found, staff at the Adelaide railway station located a brown suitcase with its label removed. The case had been checked in on the 30th of November 1948 and was believed to belong to the deceased man. In the case, there were several items of clothing with all the labels removed, although police did find the name T. Keane on a tie, Keane on a laundry bag, and Keane on a vest. A post-mortem was inconclusive, but the coroner believed the man had voluntarily ingested poison. However, despite these findings, he could not determine the actual cause of death, or whether the body had been moved after death and murder couldn't be ruled out. To try and help with identification, a plaster cast was made of the man's head and shoulders, and his fingerprints were sent around the world, but still no one came forward. The corpse was buried in Adelaide Cemetery in 1949 with a tombstone reading, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach." For over 70 years, the baffling case remained unsolved and threw up some wild theories of jilted lovers and Cold War spies. However, left with only cryptic clues to guide them, it was the emergence of DNA that finally solved the mystery. Derek Abbott, a professor at the University of Adelaide, was able to analyse the Somerton man's DNA, using hairs preserved when authorities made a plaster model of his face, and through DNA analysis, the man was identified as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born on 16th of November 1905 in Footscray, a suburb of Melbourne. Investigators were able to track down the man's living relatives, using their DNA to confirm his identity. He had 6 siblings, and he was the youngest. He went on to marry Dorothy Robertson, but at the time of his death they were separated. What happened to Dorothy is still unknown. On the 19th of May 1991, the remains of the Somerton man were exhumed, although at the time of writing this, the results of investigations on his body haven't been released, and his cause of death remains a mystery. the trunk of bones. In 1987, Newell Sessions from Thermopolis in Wyoming was given a shed by John David Morris. With the agreement, he dismantled it and moved it to his property. The shed came with a footlocker that Morris said he would come back for when he settled down. Newell left the trunk in the shed, and Morris never returned to collect it. However, for unknown reasons, in April 1992, he decided to open it and see if there was anything inside. After cutting through the padlock, he was horrified to find a whole human skeleton wrapped in plastic, along with a belt and a rotting grocery bag. Newell immediately contacted Morris, who was allegedly as surprised as he was about the macabre find. The authorities were called, and 2 days later, the skull was examined by an X-ray machine that revealed there was a bullet lodged in the man's skull. There was evidence he had also been shot in the chest. Investigators contacted John Morris, who said he had never opened the trunk, although he was vague about how he had acquired it in the first place. However, due to his age and the age of the victim, he was not considered a suspect, although it was thought he knew more than he was letting on. A murder inquiry was launched, although detectives had an almost impossible task tracking down the killer, as they had no victim identity, no time or place of death, just an old box of bones. All they had to go on was that the supermarket bag was from a Hy-Vee store, and the trunk and padlock were made in the 1930s and appeared to have been used by someone in the US Armed Services between World War I and World War II. A three-dimensional clay facial reconstruction was created to try and shed light on the man's identity. But for 24 years, the identity of the bones remained a mystery until October 2017, when a DNA sample was submitted by Kathy Mulvaney Ginn, whose father had disappeared in 1963. She had heard about the case on the TV show Unsolved Mysteries. The sample was a 99% match, and it was confirmed the bones belonged to her father, Joseph Mulvaney. Joseph Mulvaney was a railroad worker and World War II veteran who vanished from Des Moines, Iowa in 1963. At the time, he was married to Kathy's mum, Mary Alice, and the couple had 3 children together. Mary had 1 child from a previous relationship, whose name was John David Morris. However, Mary never reported her husband missing, and in 2009 she died, having lost contact with most of her family. Kathy's daughter, Shelley Statler, has since fought to bring the remains of the grandfather she never met to a final resting place in Iowa. Although the details surrounding the murder have never been confirmed, Statler believes her grandmother, Mary Alice, was the one who shot Joseph in the head, with some involvement from Morris. She thinks he was killed in Des Moines, put in the trunk and buried in the backyard of Mary's home, where he stayed until John David Morris dug him up and took the trunk with him to Wyoming. At the time the bones were found, none of the investigators knew they belonged to Morris's stepfather, although even now he is not considered a suspect. He likely knows what happened to Joseph, although that may remain a mystery forever. Sadly, Joseph never got to meet his 7 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren, but after nearly 3 decades inside a rusty old trunk and 25 more years in a Wyoming evidence locker, in 2019 he was finally laid to rest with full military rights, including a 21-gun salute. The killer clown who nearly got away with murder. In the late 1980s, Mike and Marlene Warren moved into a home in the Aero Club in Wellington, Florida, with Marlene's son, Joe Aarons, an affluent community where every house has access to a private runway. The Warrens owned several businesses, including a used car business and rental properties in West Palm Beach. On a sunny May morning in 1990, a white convertible Chrysler pulled into the Warrens' driveway, and a clown stepped out of the car. The clown wore a bright orange wig, a red nose, and a painted white smile. As Marlene opened the front door, the clown offered her flowers and 2 balloons, one with the words, "You're the greatest," printed on it. However, before she could accept them, the clown pulled out a gun and shot her in the face, then calmly walked back down the drive, got in the car and drove off. Joe and 3 of his friends witnessed the shooting. Marlene was rushed to a nearby hospital but died 2 days later. From the start, rumors circulated that Mike Warren was having an affair with Sheila Keene, who worked at the Warrens' car business. Within days, investigators learned that a woman matching Keen's description had purchased balloons and flowers from a local supermarket. The same woman also visited his store and paid cash for a clown outfit. 4 days after the murder, the white Chrysler car was found abandoned, and inside the vehicle, orange fibers that resembled strands from a clown wig were discovered. Sheila Keen became the #1 suspect. However, despite reasonably circumstantial solid evidence against her, no arrests were made. Sheila and Mike went on to marry and moved to Tennessee, where they ran a burger restaurant, before retiring in 2017 to a luxury lakeside home in Abingdon, Virginia. For 27 years, Sheila lived freely. However, in 2013, a cold case unit reopened the case and was now able to use DNA testing. On September 26, 2017, Sheila Keen Warren was arrested for first-degree murder. In 2023, after spending 5 years in jail awaiting trial, Sheila accepted a deal. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 12 years in prison for the cold-blooded murder of Marlene Warren. Because of the time served, she will likely be released before 2025. Sheila, who very nearly got away with murder, will be in her early 60s when she is released, with plenty of life left to live, unlike poor Marlene. Missing baby Melissa. In 1971, a mother's worst nightmare happened when her 22-month-old baby Melissa was stolen. Alta Apantenko had recently separated from Melissa's father, Jeffrey Highsmith, and had moved with the baby to Fort Worth. She was just 21 and needed to work. After finding a job as a waitress, she placed an advertisement in the local newspaper for a babysitter to watch Melissa. She later hired a lady called Ruth Johnson, not her real name, to look after the toddler. But on her first day of work, Johnson took Melissa out for a walk and never returned. Johnson changed Melissa's name to Melanie Miyoko and brought her up as her own, just 10 minutes away from her biological family. However, Melanie was never close to the person she thought was her mum, and something didn't feel right. She had a rough childhood and wasn't ever allowed to go outside and play. When Melanie questioned this, she was told it was because she was born at home and had brain damage. As Melanie grew up, the relationship never improved, and at 15 she ran away from home. After several bad marriages, resulting in 3 children being taken care of, and some trouble with the law, Melanie turned her life around. She settled down with her new husband, and was known as Melanie Walden, but her biological family never gave up searching for her, and when her father, Jeffrey, took a 23andMe DNA test, it showed a connection between himself and one of Melanie's 3 children. He soon realized that after over 50 years, they had finally found Melissa. The family messaged Melanie on Facebook, and at first she refused to believe it, but they insisted that she was abducted as a 1-year-old, and they had DNA evidence to prove she was missing baby Melissa in the posters they showed her. Melanie started researching articles on the case and realized the girl on the missing poster had a birthmark on her back, the same as she had. Melanie asked the woman she thought was her mum about her real identity and was told she had paid $500 for her in 1972 and that yes, she was baby Melissa. Further DNA testing confirmed that Melissa had finally been found and she was reunited with her mum, dad and 2 sisters. Melanie later changed her name back to Melissa Highsmith and was quoted as saying, "I finally have a mother and a father that want me and they love me. I finally have people that love me." Melissa has not named the woman who abducted her, and if she did, it is unlikely any charges would be brought, as the criminal statute of limitations expired in 2007. So that's it for this video. That was 5 creepy mysteries that have finally been solved in recent times. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. When you check into a motel for the night, you are promised a relaxing stay, but as you lay your head on the fluffy pillows in preparation for a restful sleep, have you ever wondered what has gone on before? Which previous guests have slept in the room you are in, or even the bed you are lying in? In this video, we aim to disturb your sleep by looking at 5 real horror stories with links to hotels and motels, some of whose guests checked in and never checked out. So sit back, lock your hotel door, and enjoy. Amana Holiday Inn, Williamsburg, Iowa. On Friday, September 12, 1980, 22-year-old mother of one, Rose Burkett, and her lover, Roger Atkinson, 32, stopped at the Amana Holiday Inn near Williamsburg, Iowa, hoping to book a room for the weekend. Initially, they were told the motel was fully booked due to a mortician's conference. However, the receptionist double-checked the book and realized there had been a cancellation for room 260. At 7:40 p.m., the couple checked into the room. However, this was not a romantic young couple spending the weekend together. It was an illicit affair. Roger was married to Marcella, and she had no idea her husband was being unfaithful. The next day, a housekeeper knocked on the door of their room, but received no answer. The door was locked, so she asked her manager for a pass key. When she opened the door, the TV was on, and she saw a foot sticking out of the bed, and assumed the couple was still asleep. However, on closer inspection, she noticed blood splats on the headboard, walls and carpet. In a state of shock, she slammed the door and ran to get help. Once the manager saw the gruesome scene, he called the Iowa County Sheriff's Department immediately. Burkett and Atkinson were found face down on the bed. Repeated blows from either an axe or hatchet had inflicted terrible injuries to the back of their heads. Atkinson also had several severed fingers, suggesting he'd tried to defend himself from the frenzied attack. Burkett was fully clothed, whereas Atkinson was wearing just shorts. Both died of acute blood loss and brain injuries. Strangely, the room showed no signs of forced entry, and 2 chairs were pulled up alongside the bed, possibly indicating some interaction with the killer or killers before the brutal slaying. Evidence also showed the killer had at one point put his feet up on the desk and used a carved piece of soap to write one word on the bathroom mirror: "This." When news of the murders broke, speculation was rife in both Iowa and the couple's hometown of Missouri. The number one suspect was Burkett's drug addict ex-boyfriend, Danny Burton, who in the weeks leading up to the murders had been reported to the police by Rose for stalking her. She was so afraid she got a dog for protection that she later found hanged and butchered in front of her home. Another suspect was Roger's uncle, the heinous serial killer Charles Hatcher, who'd recently escaped from a Nebraska mental health facility. Roger's wife Marcella was also in the frame. However, after further inquiries, all the suspects were eliminated from investigations early on. Guests and employees from the Holiday Inn were also questioned, but no action was taken against any of them. State investigators were perplexed, but did reveal that neither guns or drugs were involved in the deaths. For many years, there were no new leads in the case, which remained unsolved. In 2009, when the Iowa DCI established a cold case unit, the Rose Burkett and Roger Atkinson double slaying was listed on their new website in the hope that a breakthrough could be found. Rose's close friend Tammy Berkman also became obsessed with solving the case and compiled stacks of articles, stories, tips and files. Her drive to gain more information led to threats, and eventually a mysterious fire destroyed all her research. Despite this, Ms. Berkman still hasn't given up on finding out who killed her friend. However, to this day, what happened all those years ago in room 260 at the Amana Holiday Inn is a mystery. If only walls could talk. Rose and Roger are buried in St. Joseph Memorial Park Cemetery in Buchanan County, Missouri. If you have any information regarding the unsolved double slaying of Rose Burkett and Roger Atkinson, please get in touch using the contact numbers in the description of this video. Sheraton Hotel, Martinsburg, West Virginia. On August 10th, 1991, housekeeping staff entered room 517 of the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia, where they discovered the body of American freelance journalist Joseph Daniel Casolaro. He was found naked in the bathtub and his wrists had been cut. Blood was splattered up the walls of the bathroom, and the scene was so gruesome that one of the housekeepers fainted when she saw it. Underneath Casolaro's body, paramedics found an empty Milwaukee beer can. 2 white trash bags, and a single-edged razor blade. There was also a half-empty wine bottle nearby. Other than the ghastly scene, the hotel room was clean and tidy. On the desk was a pad and a pen. A single page had been torn out with a message saying, "To those I love the most, please forgive me for the worst possible thing I could have done. Most of all, I'm sorry to my son. I know deep down inside that God will let me in." Initially, his death was ruled as a suicide. However, Casolaro's family were convinced he had been murdered, and they revealed that before he left for Martinsburg, he had told his brother that he had been receiving harassing phone calls late at night, and some of them were threatening. He also told him that it would not be an accident if something were to happen to him. They also noted that he was well known for being squeamish and had a fear of blood and needles, and they found it incomprehensible that if he were going to commit suicide, he would do so by cutting his wrists. At the time of his death, Casolaro was working on a story called The Octopus. He was in Martinsburg to meet a source to put the final pieces together. Danny had become obsessed with the octopus and told colleagues he was close to revealing the truth about a wide range of conspiracies concerning already known cases. These included the Inslaw case, involving a software manufacturer whose owner accused the Justice Department of stealing its work product. The October surprise theory that during the Iran hostage crisis, Iran deliberately held back American hostages to help Ronald Reagan win the 1980 presidential election. And also the collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International and their funding of Iran-Contra. However, the papers that Danny left behind indicated he had got in over his head during his investigations. An array of old clippings, hard-to-read handwritten notes, and the names of former CIA officers and arms dealers were found. And it seemed like Casolaro had tried to infiltrate the murky world of guns, drugs, and organized crime. In the wake of Danny's death, several unexplained things occurred, and vague, baseless rumors about the mafia were circulated. It was also claimed that the undertaker who removed the body was an employee of the CIA, hired to clean up after an agency assassination. At the funeral, the family felt they were engulfed by mysteries, and as the ceremony drew to a close, a highly decorated military officer in US Army dress reportedly arrived in a limousine, accompanied by another man in plain clothes. The military man approached the coffin just before it was lowered into the ground, laid a medal on the lid, and saluted. Speculation about Danny's death continues into the digital age, as many websites and journalists are intrigued and fascinated by the conspiracies surrounding the octopus. Even members of an FBI task force questioned how he died and recommended further investigation, although some of the documentation surrounding their inquiries was withheld from the public without explanation. Como Motel, Richardson, Texas. From the outside, Candy Montgomery appeared to be the perfect wife and mother. She was married to Pat, an electrical engineer, and the couple and their 2 children were an active part of the community in Wiley, Collin County, Texas, where they regularly attended the Methodist Church of Lucas. Candy was outgoing and had many friends, including fellow church attendees Betty and Alan Gore, whose daughter was friends with the Montgomery children. But looks could be deceiving. In reality, Candy was bored with her marriage, and after becoming attracted to Alan Gore, she decided she wanted an affair with him. Alan, who was also having issues with his marriage, was initially shocked when Candy casually said to him, "Would you be interested in having an affair?" But eventually he did agree to a relationship. Candy meticulously planned how they would meet up, and the pair even drew up a list of the pros and cons of the affair before agreeing to go ahead with it. For about 10 months, the pair met every other week at the Como Motel in Piano, located 30 miles from Wiley, on the North Central Expressway in Richardson. These meetings started as no-strings-attached liaisons, but the couple got closer and closer and confided in each other about everything in their lives. However, Betty Gore had just given birth, and in December 1979, Alan ended the affair with Candy after feeling guilty about cheating on his wife. Despite the split, the pair remained in contact by phone, and Candy maintained her friendship with Betty. On June 13, 1980, Alan Gore was away on a business trip and became concerned when he couldn't reach his wife by phone. After calling neighbors and asking them to check on her, he later contacted Candy to ask if she had seen Betty. She told him she had gone to the house earlier to pick up the Gauses' older daughter's bathing suit because the girls were having a sleepover that night and everything was fine. In reality, something far more sinister had happened. Candy did call around to Betty's, and the two friends chatted for a while, but just as Candy was preparing to leave, Betty calmly said, "Candy, are you having an affair with Alan?" Betty then left the room and returned holding an axe in her hands, and when Candy pitifully apologized and said the affair was over, Betty flew into a rage and violently swung the axe at Candy. What happened next is Candy's account, remembered only after being hypnotized. Candy claims she begged for her life, and in response, Betty shushed her. Candy said that reminded her of her abusive childhood when her mother would silence her if she said anything. At that point, something in her snapped, and she wrestled the axe from Betty and started swinging it at her, but Betty kept getting up, so she swung some more. In total, Candy hit Betty 41 times with the axe. Investigators later revealed that 40 of the strikes occurred whilst Betty was still alive. Candy fled the scene, and it was the neighbors who found Betty's blood-covered body in the utility room. The gruesome scene was like something out of a horror movie. The majority of the blows had been aimed at Betty's face. The utility room was completely covered in blood, and poor Betty was mutilated beyond recognition. Candy, who herself was covered in Betty's blood, used the gauze shower to rinse herself before leaving Betty's baby crying upstairs and carrying on with her day as if nothing had happened. She even went to church for Bible studies with her children and the Gauses' elder daughter, and later met friends for lunch. A few weeks later, Candy was arrested and charged with Betty's murder. However, in an unexpected twist, Candy was found not guilty of murder, and the jury accepted her plea of self-defense, despite the shocking amount of times she'd hit Betty with the axe. Betty Gore's death has been portrayed in books and TV series, the most recent being the 2023 Max series Love and Death, in which Elizabeth Olsen portrayed Montgomery. It's well worth a watch. The Cursed Barclay Hotel in Los Angeles. The Van Nuys Hotel, better known as Barclay Hotel, is located at the corner of 4th Street and Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. It was built as an investment property by Isaac Van Nuys and opened in 1897. It boasted a luxurious interior and modern conveniences that were rare at that time. However, from the start, the building seemed to be cursed, and tragedy struck just 2 months after it opened. A waiter named Charles Gamble was using the elevator to bring down a tray of dishes. As the elevator neared the first floor, the elevator boy, Robert White, turned the wheel of the lever the wrong way, and instead of stopping, the cage started going back up. As it neared the 3rd floor, Robert opened the door and stepped out, but the elevator was still moving with Gamble inside. He panicked and also tried to step out, but as he did, the top of the doorway caught him and threw him forward, pinning his legs above the thighs. As the cage kept moving, it snapped them like matchsticks, and the poor man was hanging on with one foot. Finally that snapped also, and Gamble shot, head first, down the lift shaft, shattering his skull as he hit the floor. He died 1 hour later. Over the next few years, the deadly elevator caused more accidents, and in 1901 took another life. Joe Carter was looking down the lift shaft when his head was crushed by the cage descending from above him. Despite the deaths, the hotel still prospered and was frequented by some of the most fashionable people in Southern California, and even had a visit from President William McKinley and First Lady Ida McKinley. The hotel was lovingly overseen by Milo Potter and his wife Nellie M. Jones, and they tried to hold on to its respectability and elegance. But in the early 1900s, downtown Los Angeles was getting rowdy, and undesirables were opening clubs and bars in the vicinity of the hotel. Thieving bellboys and porters were a common occurrence, and con men and women started skipping out on their bills. One wealthy guest, Pacific Electric's Henry Huntington, was stalked by an insane man, and another guest was robbed at gunpoint. The reputation of the once luxurious hotel was going downhill, and in 1902 a fight broke out between kitchen staff that saw the hotel butcher stabbed to death. In 1909, Ada Tilt Otis, a Chicago heiress, checked into the Van Nuys. She was hiding the heartache of her recent divorce from her alcoholic husband, and although she could have everything money could buy, she was miserable, although no one realized just how much despair she was in until she was found dead in her room after deliberately ingesting poison. Her body was quietly removed from the hotel and shipped east for burial. By 1910, Potter and his wife had moved on, but the misfortune at the hotel continued. A wealthy older man named W. Arthur Phipps forced his much younger wife to stay with him in his suite at all times. Eventually, in 1911, he died in his room of cirrhosis of the liver. However, his soul never left, and it is said he has haunted the building ever since. By the 1920s, the hotel was getting worse. In 1924, another death occurred when William Edward Collier, who was facing divorce from his wife, fatally swallowed cyanide in front of a hotel employee who was helping him pack. His haunting suicide note laid bare his thoughts about his wife. To my wife, Ida Collier, my darling, I go never more to return. I have done my best. This is the only way I can give you the freedom you crave. I leave you with your conscience. I wish I could prevent the suffering you are going to have to endure. You can't escape that inner being, which will gnaw at your vitals to your dying breath. You made me a cheat and a liar before the world, and I gladly assumed the burden for you. You murdered my soul. Now you kill my body. So as you go through life, think of the soul roasting in hell because of you. Each night, watch my face float before you, and each day hear the moans of the tormented soul you blasted and sent to hell for eternity. In 1929, the hotel's name was changed to the Berkeley Hotel and heralded the start of a dingier, darker era. In December 1937, Elizabeth Reese, a wealthy 71-year-old woman from Akron, Ohio, checked into the Berkeley. A few days later, a maid found her sitting in a chair, her skull horrifically fractured. The motive was not robbery, as all her belongings, including a large diamond ring and a gold watch, were left untouched. The crime was never solved. The hotel's next victim was in 1944. Virgie Lee Griffin was a married waitress with a crippling drinking problem. While drinking in a local bar, she met a handsome former sailor named Otto Stephen Wilson. Griffin agreed to accompany Wilson to the Berkeley Hotel, where they checked into a room under an assumed name. Sometime during the night, Wilson choked Griffin to death after she asked him for money. He planned to cut up her body and carry it out of the hotel in packages, but this proved too difficult, and instead he left severed parts of the body in a closet where a maid found them. 3 days later, Wilson took another life when he murdered Lillian Johnson in another downtown hotel. Wilson was later convicted of both murders and was executed at San Quentin on September 20th, 1946. The hotel's fall from grace was dramatic, and similar to the infamous Hotel Cecil, the Berkeley became a magnet for desperation, addiction, and crime. In the 1970s, 3 fires killed 3 residents. Then in 1975, murder came knocking again, specifically in room 528, when a man named Samuel Suarez became a victim of serial killer Vaughn Orrin Greenwood, otherwise known as the Skid Row Slasher. His MO was to cut his victims' throats from ear to ear, drink their blood, and leave rings of salt around their bodies. Greenwood was eventually convicted of 9 murders and sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 2020. Today, the Berkeley continues life as a low-income residence, and death still lingers, with its latest victim being Los Angeles firefighter Kelly Wong, who tragically fell to his death during a training exercise at the hotel. Hotel Chelsea. The 1970s saw the birth of punk rock, an anarchic revolution of anti-everything and fashion-wise, probably one of the most recognizable youth tribes of all eras. Followers embraced brightly colored spiky mohawks, safety pins, studs, and a bucket load of attitude that pushed the boundaries across the board. The idols for this newfound genre were bands like The Clash, The Slits, and X-Ray Spex. Isle of All were the Sex Pistols, who burst onto the scene in the 70s and were one of the most culturally influential acts in popular music. Under the management of the late Malcolm McLaren, the band outraged the public with their antics. In 1977, their record God Save the Queen depicted the monarchy as a fascist regime, and was promptly banned from being played on the radio, making it the most censored record in British history. Shortly after they released their album, Anarchy, in the United Kingdom, the band's bassist Glenn Matlock fell out with lead singer Johnny Rotten and was replaced with 19-year-old John Ritchie, a self-taught bassist and friend of Rotten, who used the stage name Sid Vicious. From the start, Sid was a mess. He had a drink and drug problem and often disrupted the band's recording and live sets, although this often suited their notorious reputation. However, things spiraled out of control when Sid hooked up with 18-year-old Nancy Spungen. Nancy from Philadelphia had dropped out of college and immersed herself in the punk scene, quickly establishing herself as a punk groupie. After meeting in London, the couple became inseparable. They traversed between the United Kingdom and the United States. Nancy, who herself had a drug problem, taught the inwardly shy Sid all about sex, drugs, and the life of a New York rocker, much to the disdain of the other band members who hated the influence Spungen had on Sid and believed she was fueling his addiction. In January 1978, the Sex Pistols unexpectedly broke up, leaving Sid with lots of money and just Nancy to focus on. In August of the same year, the couple moved into Hotel Chelsea in New York City, whose previous guests included Bob Dylan, Patti Smith, and Jackson Pollock. The couple's drug use was now out of control, and on the night of October 11th, 1978, after a night with friends, Sid was witnessed taking as many as 30 tablets of the sleeping pill Tuinal, a dose most humans couldn't survive. By all accounts, the pills knocked Sid out for hours. At 10 a.m. the following day, Sid frantically called the front desk asking for help. Allegedly, he had found Nancy on the bathroom floor covered in blood. Nancy had been stabbed in the stomach and bled to death. She was just 20 years old. Sid Vicious was arrested and charged with Nancy's murder after he confessed to the killing. However, he later retracted his confession, claiming he was passed out at the time she died. Sid was released on $25,000 bail supplied by his record company. In the days following his release, he unsuccessfully attempted suicide by cutting his wrists. Soon after, Vicious revoked his bail conditions after assaulting Patti Smith's brother with a broken bottle. He was imprisoned at Riker Island before being re-released after an additional $10,000 was paid. On February 1st, 1979, Sid attended a party with his drug addict mother, Anne Beverly, at his new girlfriend, Michelle Robinson's apartment. Anne had supplied the drugs for the evening. The following day, Anne and Michelle found Sid dead from an apparent heroin overdose. Next to his body was a syringe, a spoon, and a substance. He was just 21 years old. To this day, theories about who killed Nancy are still circulating, and many suggest there is no way Sid Vicious could be responsible because he was out cold from the barbiturates. Malcolm McLaren also believed Sid was innocent, unless it was a botched double suicide. He stated, "She was the first and only love of his life." So that's 5 truly terrifying hotel and motel horror stories. Let us know in the comment section below if you watched this video while staying in a hotel or motel, or if you've ever visited any of the places mentioned in this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. Every now and again, a story appears that is stranger than fiction. Some are tragic, some are horrifying, others a mixture of both. It could be a strange disappearance, a supernatural attack, or a terrifying case of mistaken identity. But what makes the following 10 tales truly frightening is that they are all true. So if you're ready for this, then hit the lights, sit back, and enjoy. Now, before we begin, we'd like to say a special thank you to this video's sponsor, Established Titles. If you've tuned in to Top 5s before, then you'll know we love to cover creepy, inexplainable mysteries on this channel. While today we're bringing you something a little different, but just as intriguing. This video is sponsored by Established Titles, the project that lets you buy a plot of land in Eddleston, Scotland. Established Titles is a fun and novel way to preserve the natural woodlands of Scotland, while helping global reforestation efforts. The project is based on the old Scottish custom, where if you own land, you can call yourself a laird, or lord or lady in regular English. Once you buy your plot, you'll get an official certificate with a crest, as well as your unique plot number. Not only can you use this title on your credit card statement or phone bill, but Established Titles also plants a tree with every order, working with charities like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to help reforest our planet. It makes a great last-minute gift, especially as Established Titles is running a massive Black Friday sale right now. Go to establishedtitles.com/top5s and use our code TOP5s to get an additional 10% off. Plus, the first 200 people who purchase a title pack using our link will effectively be next to our own plot, only a few minutes away. Depending on how many of you want to be a lord or lady, we could build our own Top 5's kingdom in Scotland. So thanks to Established Titles for sponsoring this video. Go get your own plot of land near ours, and use our code TOP5s for an additional 10% off. And now, if you haven't already done so, hit those lights, sit back, and enjoy. The Humpty Doo Poltergeist. Humpty Doo is a small town in the Northern Territory of Australia, not far from Darwin. Humpty Doo is also an Australian slang term, which means everything is turned upside down or topsy-turvy. It's actually the perfect description for the sort of phenomena caused by a poltergeist. The following activity began in 1998 with classic behaviour, when the residents of 90 McMinns Drive, Andrew and Kirsty Agius, and their friends, who were sitting out on the porch, were plagued with a shower of pebbles. After moving indoors, the commotion continued, with stones falling through the air from just below the ceiling, all through the house, on tables, floors, beds, and even their heads. The pebbles appeared to be from the owner's own driveway, and felt warm when touched. Later that night, other objects began to appear from nowhere. Small batteries, spanners, and most alarmingly, knives and shards of broken glass dropped and flew across the rooms. Over the next few days, the vandalism began. A CD player was flung onto the floor, then glass cabinet doors and windows were smashed by a flying ashtray. Appliances were ripped off counters, mattresses were overturned, and the most sinister part was the scraping noises coming from inside the walls. Despite the intervention of 3 priests, the Polt, as the residents like to call it, refused to be calmed. Creepiest of all were the words and symbols that began to materialize on the walls, written in marker pen or spelled out in Scrabble tiles on the floor. Troy, skin, fire, car, and help were the first set of words to appear. This is chilling when you consider that their friend Troy had been burned to death in a car crash very near to the property just before the poltergeist activity began. After being terrorized for 4 long months by the Polt, it left just as abruptly as it had arrived, and the event is still unexplained to this day. Mashio Hoshino's last photograph. Mashio was a wildlife photographer who was considered to be one of the most accomplished men in his field. Born in 1952 in Japan, he grew up with an interest in nature and began hiking and exploring his native country. Whilst at university, he came across a photograph of a small village in the Bering Sea named Shishmaref. Intrigued by the remoteness of the tiny snow-covered settlement and keen to know what life was like there, Mishio wrote a letter to the mayor of the village. It took several months for a reply to arrive, but in the summer of 1973, Mishio was invited to spend 3 months in Shishmaref, staying with a local family. Having studied photography back in Japan, Mishio was soon recording everything he experienced on camera. He spent the next 18 years traveling all over the state of Alaska and photographing his extended stays in the wilderness. He was also a talented writer, recording stories about the land and its peoples as he traveled. His photographs were widely published and lauded around the world. It was on one of his trips to photograph bears in Kamchatka, Russia in August 1996 that his life was tragically cut short. Mishio and his team were able to track down a large brown bear near the shores of Kuril Lake. The bear was easy to photograph as it was not afraid of humans and continued to fish as they approached, allowing for close-up shots. It became clear from traces left at the campsite that the bear was stalking them, and a Russian guide warned Mishio that he should sleep indoors, but he refused and instead stayed in his tent. You can guess what happened next. At night, the bear ripped through the fabric and dragged Michio away to his death. It is rumoured that when huntsmen shot the bear, Michio's hands were found in its stomach. It would seem that the image of a snarling bear, said to have been taken by Michio just moments before his death and circulated on the net, was actually an entry for a Photoshop competition to create a last photo taken before death. But it's terrifying to think that this is probably what Michio seen before his demise. Sadly, he was only 43 when he died, leaving his wife and son. Gormander and Geirfinnur. In January 1974, an 18-year-old labourer named Gormander set off to walk home in a snowstorm. At some point he was seen by a passing motorist, as he almost fell in front of the car. After this, he was never seen again. 10 months later in November, Geirfinnur was at home when he received a phone call. He immediately left and drove to a harbour cafe in nearby Keflavik. His keys were found in the car ignition, but he too disappeared. This all took place in Iceland, a country with an extremely low murder rate, and an investigation was opened, but the Icelandic police had no witnesses, motive, bodies, or forensic evidence, and the pressure from both the media and the public was intense. Before long, a man named Savar, who was a petty criminal, and his girlfriend Erla were picked up and questioned. This began a fantastical tale that became known as the Reykjavik Confessions, which revolved around nightclubs, fraud, smuggling, nightmares, and murder. As well as Savar and Erla, eventually 4 more suspects signed confessions for the murders, although none of them could actually remember committing the crimes. Those accused were not given any access to their lawyers, were kept in isolation, and interviewed for hours at a time. They were given antipsychotic and sedative drugs, subjected to water torture and sleep deprivation. The suspects said that they signed the confessions to be allowed out of solitary confinement. Erla was held there for 242 days, and another 2 prisoners were held for over 600. Outside of Guantanamo Bay, these are the longest periods that any defendant has spent in isolation. All 6 were convicted, and sentences range from life imprisonment for Savar to between 12 and 3 years for the others. It wasn't until 2011 that the case became famous for its false memory syndrome, police corruption, and unreliable confessions. The twin gynecologist's strange death. It was an oppressively hot day, and there had been several complaints about the foul smell coming from the fashionable Manhattan apartment of 460 East. On the 17th of July 1975, Bill Terrell was the handyman at the 63rd Street and York Avenue building, so he went up to the 10th floor to take a look. The apartment was locked, but Bill let himself in with the maintenance key. Inside he found the body of Dr. Cyril Marcus, lying face down on the bed in a pair of shorts. In another room on the floor next to what was almost the same bed, Bill found the body of Cyril's identical twin brother, Dr. Stuart Marcus. He was completely naked and lying face up. The place was a mess, with filthy clothing, empty liquor bottles, soda cans, discarded food, and money scattered around. One of the armchairs was smeared with human feces, but there was no sign of any struggle. The medical examiner stated that the twins were in their mid-40s when they died. Stuart had been dead for 4 days, and Cyril for only 2. He thought their deaths could have been caused by drugs or chemicals, but 30 tests were unable to determine what caused the gynecologist's deaths. Although there was said to be over 100 prescription drug bottles, there were no sign of any narcotics or alcohol in either of the men's systems. Growing up, the twins spent all of their time with one another and began their medical residences together also. They wore similar clothing, sometimes talking just to one another and excluding others. They began a private practice, were known nationally, and even wrote a classic textbook together. But at some point, the twins' behavior towards their patients became unpredictable and arrogant, as they spiraled into a drug addiction with barbiturates and amphetamines. Pregnant women were shouted and screamed at, and one even had surgical instruments thrown at her. It seems the men tried to kick their habit alone at Cyril's flat after stocking up on food and medication, but at some point between the 10th and 14th of July, it seems that Stuart died. Cyril, who was disorientated, was seen out on the street by the doorman after this date, but returned to the flat where he also died. New tests showed traces of barbiturates in Stuart's body, but the cause of Cyril's death still remains a mystery. The Barari deaths. On the morning of 1st of July 2018, in the Barari district of Delhi, India, 11 members of the Chundawat family were found dead. 10 of them were hanging from the ceiling. The grandmother, being the oldest family member, was found on the bedroom floor strangled. A belt hung from the wardrobe handle. The Chadwats owned a grocery store, which usually opened between 5 and 5:30 am. At 7:30 am, a neighbour went to see why the shop was still closed. When he saw that the door was open, he stepped inside and found the whole family hanging. The police were sent for, but before their arrival, hundreds of people had turned up at the shop. Some had even gone inside, trampling all over the evidence. One person even made a video of the horrific scene and posted it online. 9 of the victims were found close together in the living room, suspended from a metal grill in the skylight, with one female victim suspended alone in the corner. They all had nooses made from brightly coloured saracen wire. They were blindfolded, and some of the bodies had their hands and feet tied with rope. Their heads were wrapped in cloth, their ears plugged with cotton wool, and their mouths taped shut. 11 diaries were found at the house, which detailed how the younger son, Lalit, had become convinced that he was possessed by the spirit of his dead father. He had become head of the household and convinced the others over 11 years that his orders had to be followed no matter what. The details of an obscure religious ritual were found in the last diary, which matched how the bodies looked when they were found. Could the family have obeyed Lalit and entered into some sort of ceremony that had gone wrong? As the bodies showed no signs of a struggle, it is possible. So mass suicide, a religious ritual gone wrong, or murder? Either way, 11 members of the same family had died in the most chilling way, the youngest being Lalit's own son, Shivam, who was just 15 years old. Amir Sadeghi. It was a perfectly normal Sunday afternoon in Cardiff, Wales on April 2010 for the Sadeghi family. Mum Parveen, Dad Iqbal, and their son, 17-year-old Amir. At just after 1:30, Amir went to answer the door, thinking it was his Korean teacher. Instead, 2 men who were hiding their faces in balaclavas stood on the doorstep. They both held knives and immediately jumped on Amir, stabbing him in a frenzied attack. Amir tried his best to get away from them, even getting to the dining room before he collapsed, but the 2 assailants didn't stop. They followed the teenager and continued to hack at his body. Amir's parents desperately tried to help their son. Parveen jumped on top of one of the men, while his father tried to pull them away, but the attackers slashed out and injured them both before running out of the house. Amir died at the scene. Both of the murderers, who it turned out were high on heroin at the time, had been howling throughout the attack. The investigation found CCTV footage of the 2 killers, and Ben Hope and Jason Richards were soon arrested. They blamed each other for the attack, and it emerged that they had been hired by a man named Mohammed Al-Aghi, who had paid them £1,000 each to kill a local businessman who lived in the next street. Mohammed was angry over a property deal that had gone wrong. The businessman lived on Shiley Road, which was next to Ninian Road, where the Sakis lived. In their drug-addled state, the men had gone to the wrong street. Hope and Richards were sentenced to life imprisonment. Mohammed was arrested in New Delhi, India, but he escaped from court in 2017 whilst awaiting extradition. Mohammed is still at large, and anyone with any information is asked to contact the police. Bird attack on Monterey Bay. In August of 1961, thousands of seabirds suddenly changed from their normal flight path after feeding off the coast of Rio del Mar, California. A thick fog had enveloped Monterey Bay, and the birds needed somewhere to shore. At about 3:30 am, they arrived at Capitola, and residents there were awakened by the cacophony of thudding noises on their roofs, and the sounds of seabirds crying like babies as they regurgitated anchovies and knocking themselves out by slamming into buildings. Some residents were brave enough to go outside with flashlights, but found that the frantic avians, which are named sooty shearwaters, flew straight at them. Like something out of a scene from the film The Birds, some people were even bitten. The following morning, the streets were covered with dead and dazed birds and half-eaten anchovies. The survivors were too weak to fly, so the residents gathered them up and took them back to the ocean. There, many made a recovery, but truckloads of the dead birds were taken away and disposed of from all along the Monterey Bay area. So what had caused the birds to become crazed? In 1991, there was another mass of bird deaths in the same area, and scientists found that this was due to a toxic algae bloom. The Scripps Institute for Oceanography had collected zooplankton from Monterey Bay in 1961, which was found to contain a neurotoxin called domoic acid. The anchovies had eaten the deadly algae, and the sooty shearwaters had eaten the anchovies, thereby poisoning themselves and causing memory loss, disorientation, and seizures. Navy blimp AL-8. On the 16th of August 1942, the AL-8 blimp took off from Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay just after 6 a.m. These non-rigid airships had been used regularly to patrol the seas around the California coast, following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in 1941. There were 2 crew members aboard the blimp, Lieutenant Junior Grade Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Adams. Both were experienced pilots. Due to a weather issue with the airship, their flight mechanic was unable to join them. At about 7:50, Lieutenant Cody radioed into the control tower to say that they had seen a suspicious oil slick near Farallon Islands and were going to investigate. Stand by was the last communication to be sent from the AL-8 before the signal was lost. 2 ships that were in the area reported seeing the airship circling around as though it was searching for something in the water. The blimp dropped several flares into the sea, and at some point between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m, it came very low to the water and the crew could be clearly seen. Then an hour before it was due, the airship headed back towards San Francisco. The pilot of a Pan-American airplane reported seeing the blimp quite steadily passing the Golden Gate Bridge at 11 a.m, but shortly before it crashed down on a busy street in front of a house at 419 Bellevue Avenue, Daly City. The cockpit was empty and both of the crew members had vanished. Both parachutes and the life raft were still on board, and the radio was in perfect working order. Despite an extensive search, no trace of the men was ever found. Theories range from capture by the Japanese to UFO abduction. Whatever happened to the crew of the AL-8 ghost blimp remains a mystery to this day. Night deaths of Asian men. In July 1983, the Los Angeles Times printed an article titled, "Night Deaths of Asian Men Explained." The piece claimed that young and healthy Japanese men and women were dying suddenly in their sleep every year. There had also been similar deaths among Filipinos and Southeast Asian refugees living in the US. The Japanese called the mysterious disease pokuri, which can be translated to mean that death occurs suddenly with a snap. None of the victims, who were mostly men, suffered from heart disease. In 1980, there were 80 of these deaths just in Tokyo alone, and 76 of them were men. It was estimated that between 500 and 1,000 were dying from pokuri in an average year. It was named nocturnal death syndrome by 2 American researchers who said it was a baffling phenomenon. In the Philippines, the deaths are said to be caused by a disease called bangangut. The men there are thought to die during or just after a nightmare. The article is thought to have inspired director Wes Craven to write his horror masterpiece, A Nightmare on Elm Street, where teenagers are stalked and killed by Freddy Krueger in their own nightmares. Juliana Kapka, the lone survivor. Juliana was born in Lima, Peru. His parents established Panguama, a biological research station in the Amazon rainforest, when she was 4. On Christmas Eve of 1971, the now 17-year-old Juliana and her mother boarded Lancer Flight 508. Her father was not happy with his wife and daughter flying with the airline because it had a bad reputation, but it was the only flight available. The flight encountered thunderstorms and serious turbulence before being struck by lightning. The plane broke apart mid-air, and Juliana found herself free-falling, still strapped into a seat. She plummeted 10,000 feet before landing in the Peruvian rainforest. With a concussion, broken collarbone, an eye injury, and a deep wound on her right arm, Juliana drifted in and out of consciousness for half a day. Then, following water downstream, she began to trek through the jungle. Juliana came across 3 dead passengers, rammed headfirst into the ground, but was relieved to find that none of them was her mother. She had to deal with serious insect bites and a maggot-infested arm, but on the 10th day of her nightmare, she found some gasoline in a lodging hut and poured it over the wound. A few hours later, 3 lodgers discovered her and took her to the hospital, where she was reunited with her father. Later, she was able to take rescuers back to the wreckage of the plane. Of the 96 on board, everyone had died except for Juliana. About 14 other passengers survived the initial impact, but died while waiting for rescue, including her mother. It was later discovered that the aircraft was assembled entirely from spare parts of other planes. So that's it for this video. That was 10 truly horrifying real-life stories. If you would like us to go in depth on any one of these 10 topics, then head over to Patreon to take part in the poll. The topic with the highest votes will be featured in an in-depth podcast episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. We'd like to thank Established Titles for sponsoring this video. Hi everyone. For the better part of 2022, we've been hard at work developing a new channel with one of our trusted writers, researchers and friend, TJ Roosh, covering one of the most fascinating periods in American history, the Wild West. Today, we're incredibly excited to announce this partnership with Footprints of the Frontier, your one-stop shop for all things related to the lawlessness and intrigue of the Old West. While Footprints of the Frontier will cover mostly history, culture and classic folk tales of the era, there will be plenty of content related to our own videos on Top 5s, including listicles and documentaries about haunted ghost towns, true crime on the frontier, and creepy stories from the Western territories of the United States. We promise you won't be disappointed, as the work and passion for this project is truly second to none. We've got lots of brilliant ideas in the pipeline as well, so it really is just the beginning. To launch our partnership, we're debuting an especially spine-chilling episode from the channel for the first time to our Top 5 audience. So without further ado, grab your saddle, pack up your rations, and ride along with us as we venture into the wild and wonderful Western world and leave our footprints on the American frontier.
If you were to jump into a time machine and take a trip through both space and time, back to the heyday of the Wild West, you'd walk into the settled communities turned ghost towns, all riddled with the same establishments. Regardless of town or territory, you'll more than likely find a stagecoach station, a couple of general stores, countless saloons, and if your ghost town saw its fair share of vices, probably a dance hall or gambling house on the outskirts. Without a doubt, however, between all settlements and interstate junctions, the most consistent business offered by these small locales were hotels, filled with travelers, transplants, and dogged men finding their place on a frontier filled with the unknowns. The American West was a popular land for those going places, whether it was the dreamy young folks leaping coast to coast, or outlaws running town to town from a bounty, or even desperate workers spinning job site to job site. The popular nature of travel in the Wild West also came hand in hand with the lawlessness the territory saw, hotels becoming the breeding ground for vigilante justice, untempered gunfights, and just about any other seedy activity you could imagine. With these patterns then came the stories that they left behind, as many Western hotels saw the notorious and infamous figures leave behind a legacy both of intrigue and horror. As towns were abandoned and their hotel rooms left empty, the ghosts came back to flock the Western frontier with an unsettling presence, leaving the people who visit afterwards to get a spine-chilling sense of the spirits that linger in the shadows of yesteryear. To dive deeper into these mysterious happenings and the frightening folklore behind them, here are 3 of the most haunted hotels from the Wild West. The origins of the Bullock Hotel date back all the way to August 1876 in Helena, Montana, where American businessman and politician Seth Bullock ran his small hardware outfit while carrying out his duties as sheriff of Lewis and Clark County. Meanwhile, 500 miles away, in the recently gold-stricken settlement called Deadwood of the Dakota Territory, legendary gunfighter Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back of the head by Jack McCall during a game of cards. the lethal gunshot spurred loud cries by the rest of the Deadwood citizens, who were exhausted by the outright violence and general lawlessness Deadwood had seen in the few years since gold was discovered in the nearby Black Hills. Not long afterwards, Seth Bullock arrived in Deadwood with fellow frontiersman Solomon Starr. The two had pegged the gold rush town as a potential fit for their future hardware store, and moved from Montana to capitalize on the opportunity. On that humid August afternoon, Bullock and company rode into Deadwood on their ox-drawn caravan, prepped with Dutch ovens and mining gear. They set up a tent by nightfall and were auctioning off equipment and turning a small profit before the sun could rise the following day. Soon, they advertised themselves as Office of Starr and Bullock, auctioneers and commission merchants. Within a few months, the shrewd business duo were seeing success after success, and eventually bought a vacant lot on the corner of Main Street and Wall Street. This is where their business would run henceforth, evolving from a simple tent to an entire warehouse fronted by a sturdy hardware store. While the hardware trade was off to a booming success, that wasn't the only draw to Bullock's recent arrival in the gold rush town. Deadwood saw Bullock's history as a lawman and former sheriff in Montana as the perfect resume for Sheriff of Deadwood. The recent shooting of Wild Bill Hickok forced the hand of higher-ups across the Dakota Territory and frontier at large, the rate of violence untenable for much longer. Of course, Seth Bullock was up to the task, embracing the role without reservations. In March of 1877, just a little over 6 months since Bullock's arrival in Deadwood, he was appointed as the first sheriff by the former governor of the Dakota Territory, John L. Pennington. It didn't take long for Bullock to establish a presence in the town, once known for its outlaws and vices. He gathered up a ragtag team of deputies he felt matched his fearless, hard-nosed demeanor, and set out to change Deadwood from crime and chaos to law and order. Unfortunately, Bullock's reign didn't last long, as an official election was held later in November of 1877, and John J. Manning was voted sheriff by the citizens of Deadwood. Nevertheless, Bullock didn't let the decision deter his efforts in the town. In fact, his short stint as sheriff was so successful, he felt Deadwood was safe enough to bring up his wife and daughter from their home in Michigan. A couple of years later, in September of 1879, Bullock and Starr's hardware store at the corner of Main and Wall Streets survived a raging fire that laid waste to over 300 separate buildings and the precious mementos belonging to Deadwood citizens. As a result, many folks affected by the fire left town to start fresh elsewhere, but it didn't deter the likes of Seth Bullock or Sol Starr. Rather, they used the opportunity to bring uplifted spirits to the remaining folks of Deadwood, and saw continued success over the next decade and a half. That is, until 1894, when the hardware store did fall victim to another intense fire, with the entirety of the storefront burning to ash. While the warehouse in the back managed to stay standing, Bullock and Starr were left in the rubble that they so luckily avoided back in 1879. The two business partners didn't let the newfound opportunity go to waste. From the ashes, Bullock and Starr constructed a brand new structure to be transformed into not only a brand new general store, but also the finest hotel in all of Deadwood, South Dakota, and the surrounding settlements. Thus, wagon after wagon carrying the white and pink sandstone from Boulder Canyon was hauled in, and the beginnings of the Bullock Hotel were underway. In its first rendition, the Bullock Hotel was designed in the Italianate style, with Victorian notes dotted throughout the structure. When you entered the lobby, one could see carpet of the finest red velvet canvassing the floor, with oak trim lining the corners and big, beautiful brass chandeliers hanging overhead. Not only that, but the hotel itself featured a massive restaurant with 100 seats, a gorgeous grand piano, 63 bedrooms made from the finest materials, luxurious bathrooms, as well as a library and parlor sitting just off the balcony. It didn't take long for the Bullock Hotel to not only become the talk of the town, but the talk of western South Dakota and the western frontier in general. By 1900, the hotel featured a gentleman's bar adjacent to the building, and Bullock lived in the remaining years of his life in full servitude to his most prized business, before dying of cancer on his private ranch in 1919. In 1976, the hotel was sold and transitioned back into just a hardware store, until it was reacquired by Bullock Properties in the 1990s and restored to a hotel. The present-day version operates much like it did in 1895, albeit with fewer rooms featuring modern bathrooms and updated finishings. While Seth Bullock is no longer around physically to look after his hotel, many folks claim he still wanders around the structure on a spiritual level. Bully's Restaurant and Seth's Cellar, two iconic locations within the building, are the most popular places to see the imposing ghost of Bullock himself. The reasoning is that Bullock remains at the hotel to make sure even the present-day staff stick to their work. These ghost sightings and other supernatural happenings usually occur in moments when workers slow down or stop their labor completely. These paranormal events include floating silverware or dishes, self-operating shower heads, flickering lights, and stationary objects sliding left or right with no one around. There's also the constant reports of hearing a male's voice, most likely that of Seth Bullock, calling out guests by their correct name during late-night hours. These are usually paired with other instances of footsteps in empty rooms and whistling throughout corridors. If one were to enter the bedrooms located on the second or third floor, they might find a strange apparition in the background of their photographs. That is, if the camera works at all. The Bullock Hotel also plays host to a beautiful antique clock that's been broken for years, and yet guests will still hear it chime from time to time. And that's not the only clock-related scare. If one fancies unplugging their alarm clock before sleeping, they might still awake to the blaring sounds of the alarm screech, finding a power source where there originally wasn't one. Whatever power source this is can't be fathomed, but it's probably the same supernatural source that keeps the televisions playing during outages and lights flickering on even when the bulbs are dead. The most frequent sighting comes in the form of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the hotel. Some say they can see a man dressed in black, hiding behind the crowds that form in the lobby, while others state that the shadows look like a tall cowboy covered in darkness, stationed at the bar in the cellar before disappearing in the blink of an eye. The Bullock Hotel is now so well known for its haunts and horrors, official ghost tours can be experienced by Deadwood visitors year-round. It's been the subject of popular series, Ghost Adventures and Unsolved Mysteries, and is the perfect relic depicting the ghosts of the Wild West in their purest form. In the early 1890s, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad sought further expansion of its development into Wyoming and the surrounding territories. As the railroad was scheduled to run through the recently appointed county seat of Sheridan County, city officials knew traffic through the town would increase. This, combined with money from Chicago investors to expand the coal mining industries around Sheridan, provided the need for further lodging near the railroad. As a result, the railroad company hired the bright mind of architect Thomas R. Kimball to design a top-end hotel for Sheridan to attract westward travelers. Kimball remembered the luxurious display of hotels he found in Scotland not too long prior, and felt it was the perfect style to fit the newly named Sheridan Inn. The Sheridan was built as a 3-story structure with large porches set along each of the 64 rooms, all featuring a window and electric lights. The Sheridan was also the first Wyoming lodging to offer bathtubs to its visitors, and was long considered the finest of all hotels between Chicago and San Francisco. The Sheridan Inn officially opened on May 27, 1893, with a grand ceremony welcoming guests into the freshly furnished dining room a month later on June 27th. This celebration was led by legendary soldier and showman Buffalo Bill Cody, who would take over the management of the hotel the following year. In the meantime, the Sheridan was initially managed by George and Lucy Canfield. They mostly hosted fellow Wyoming ranchers who needed a place to stay while their actual homes were being built. During these days, it only cost $1 a night for a stay, in addition to a quarter breakfast or a $half lunch or dinner. For long-term residents, they could purchase a meal ticket for $7 that was good for 21 meals at any point of the day. After a few months, Buffalo Bill Cody realized a new potential with the Sheridan's clientele. He was popular amongst buffalo hunters, as he was one of the finest in all of the West. With all of his fellow big-game hunters looking for lodging in the nearby Bighorn Mountains, the Sheridan Inn was the perfect place to entertain guests and give his hunters the stay of their lifetime. Thus, in 1894, Buffalo Bill purchased the Sheridan, which just so happened to sit across the street from his own stagecoach station called the W.F. Cody Transportation Company. Between 1894 and 1901, when Buffalo Bill sold the Sheridan, he hosted countless extravagant parties that saw the most important names stay within the walls of the Wyoming Hotel. Even after Buffalo Bill passed on the ownership, celebrities and well-known folks from around the United States flocked to the Sheraton Inn, including the likes of Ernest Hemingway, Herbert Hoover, and Bob Hope. By the 1960s, the building was labeled condemned, as it had fallen by the wayside with drastically decreased patronage and uninterested ownership. In the 50-plus years since, the Sheraton has switched between various owners, reopened as a community center, before being refurbished into a restaurant and most recently as a hotel once more. It's through these reopenings and renewal of the Sheraton as a functioning hotel that its paranormal history was finally experienced by both workers and patrons alike. The ghost stories originate all the way back to the final years of Buffalo Bill's involvement with the hotel, when a small family from Virginia moved to Sheraton, Wyoming. The family, called the Arnolds, had a daughter named Catherine, who was 22 years old at the time and in search of employment. Within weeks of their arrival, Catherine acquired a position at the Sheraton, where she acted as a jack of all trades. For 64 years, Catherine remained loyal to the hotel, taking on the duties of a housekeeper, clerk, and seamstress, just to name a few. In 1965, Catherine, who is now referred to as Miss Kate by her admirers, was out of a job after the building was shut down. However, the position was returned to her when new ownership reopened the inn by 1967 as a dancing and dining hall. A year later, in 1968, Miss Kate passed away, but not before delivering one final request in her will: to be laid to rest at the only place she ever called home, the Sheraton Inn. To honor her wishes, the folks at the hotel took her ashes and placed them within the walls of her third-story room, seemingly the end of Miss Kate's presence at the Sheraton. However, that would hardly be the case as the years went on. By the 1990s, the inn was transformed into a lunch and dinner restaurant called the Wyoming Rib and Chop House. Through this transition, Miss Kate's original bedroom was renovated, but her favorite chair was kept against the same wall her ashes resided in. From here on out, the staff at the Sheraton, regardless of its name or ownership, has claimed to feel the presence of Miss Kate nearly every single day, and especially every single night. Besides the occasional light flicker or door slam, the most popular paranormal event within Sheraton's walls is a cold spot phenomenon, occurring in that very room Miss Kate called home for over 60 years. Employees have reported that cold spots move to different areas of the room, but can also be felt around the ballroom and near windows on the first floor, all places Miss Kate frequented during her time there. Passerby will also report strange happenings around the upstairs windows. One such tale was told by a man who drove by around 2 a.m., only to see the third-floor windows darkened by closed drapes. 30 minutes later, the same man drove by again, but this time, the windows were clear of drapes and the lights shone from above. At first, the man just thought a guest might have awoken in the early morning hours. However, upon closer inspection, the inn was currently closed at the time, and there were no visitors allowed to stay the night at the Sheraton. When the man called, the staff informed him that they didn't have any overnight employees who were working within rooms at such a late hour, but were unaware of any break-ins or criminal activity in the town at the time. If one were to visit the Sheraton Inn in modern times, you might hear a lonely lady's footsteps stomping around empty rooms or the whirring of a phantom sewing machine, handled by the ghost of the woman who looked after the Sheraton Inn from the days of Buffalo Bill to the later days of its deconstruction. One thing is for sure, the hotel itself wasn't the only thing brought back from the ashes, but rather 100-plus years of history and haunts and the restless soul of one of Wyoming's most treasured icons. At the turn of the 20th century, western Arizona saw a boom in mining camps and small settlements pop up across its arid deserts and rocky hillsides. One such tent city was called Oatman, Arizona, serving as both a resting spot and home base for a slew of miners and their infrequent families looking for work in the southwestern region of the United States. In 1902, city planners in Oatman realized the potential for additional lodging to accompany the increase in population and hired John Derlin to construct the Derlin Hotel in 1902. The Derlin featured 8 rooms in its 2-story structure, located right in the heart of Main Street. It was designed with the Spanish colonial revival architecture in mind, built with adobe, and attracted additional mining parties over the next few years. The hotel and the town of Oatman in general saw an explosion in success in 1915, when a nearby mining company discovered over $10 million worth of gold in the vicinity, valued at nearly $300 million when adjusted for inflation. With the 1915 gold rush, Oatman saw its population grow to over 3,500 people, and the Durlin Hotel was sold out on almost a nightly basis. Unfortunately, the fame and fortune didn't last forever. In the 5 years between 1915 and 1920, Oatman fell victim to 3 separate fires, all incredibly destructive that saw most of the town razed to the ground. Luckily, the Durlin Hotel was never completely destroyed, and repairs brought it back to its former glory by the time the Roaring Twenties were underway. Again, though, the Durlin's second wind was short-lived, as the United Eastern Mines shut down in 1924, effectively removing all major mining operations in Arizona on a permanent basis. Just as all seemed lost for the Durlin Hotel and the Oatman at large, the legendary Route 66 highway was installed across the southern United States. With travelers now stopping by the ghost town to be, tourism drove Oatman back into relevancy, and the Durlin could keep its doors open. Over the next 40 years or so, the Durlin Hotel played host to countless tourists and honeymooners, but maybe none more famous than the likes of Hollywood icons Clark Gable and his newlywed wife, Carole Lombard. The pair spent their first night as a married couple at the Durlin, and returned to Oatman, Arizona to get away from the spotlight various times over the next 3 years, until sadly, Carole Lombard passed away from a plane crash in 1942. Nevertheless, the Durlin Hotel continued its famous run until the 1960s put an end to its heyday for good. By this point, Interstate 40 was completed, and the popularity of Route 66 quickly diminished, as travelers started using the faster and wider I-40 to trek across the Arizona deserts, either into California or back east to New Mexico. As a result, the Durlin Hotel, ultimately renamed to the Oatman Hotel, couldn't continue its operation like it once had in the early 20th century. The town itself dwindled down to about 100-year-long residence, and Oatman now features just a couple of gift shops, tourist attractions, and restaurants, most notably the Oatman Hotel, which presently no longer offers hotel accommodations for guests. The lack of lodging at the Oatman Hotel, however, doesn't detract from its modern-day infamy. Rather, the hotel has now regained popularity purely for its acclaimed paranormal sightings and all-around spooky supernatural events. The biggest draw of the Oatman is the rumors that it still houses the ghosts of Clark Gable and Carole Lombard, frequent admirers of the hotel even in the afterlife. Folks who tour the hallways often speak about hearing quiet laughter and muffled whispers around the room Gable and Lombard stayed in every time they paid a visit to the Oatman. While the building no longer operates as a functioning hotel, it has kept the Gable-Lombard room in the same style it was in when the couple first stayed in 1939, giving visitors a unique look back in time and history. One account goes that a few years ago, a photographer was taking pictures of the old Gable-Lombard honeymoon suite for a personal project. When he went to develop the photographs, however, he noticed a gray apparition of what appeared to be the ghost of an adult male lingering in the background of the empty room. While the photographer believed the ghostly silhouette was the spirit of Clark Gable, he threw out his entire Oatman Hotel project out of the fear of further haunts. Another mystifying phenomenon at the hotel was the reports of the invisible sleepers. On the second floor, there is a room called the Theater Room Museum, which still houses a couple of beds that had been in the room since the early days of the Durlin. On more than one occasion, a maid has entered the Theater Room Museum and found imprints in the dust on the bed that perfectly resemble the outline of someone sleeping. Thinking there must have been an intruder, investigators were brought in, but found nothing else in the room had been tampered with, or in the hotel at large. The current staff at the hotel believe these imprints were left behind by the ghost of an original chambermaid who returned to the Oatman after passing in the room long ago. The restless spirits of the two Golden Age icons and a former worker aren't the only ones lurking in the shadows of the Durlin. Legend has it that there's a third guest room still occupied by the ghost of an old Irish miner by the name of Odie. The story goes that Odie came to America at the end of the 19th century with a plan to strike gold and build a fortune for his family's future in the United States. In a horrifying twist, however, Odie's family never made it across the Atlantic and died at sea before they could reunite with the Irish miner. Unable to cope with his loss, Odie turned to alcohol and spent many a night drinking by his lonesome in his little dark room at the Durlin Hotel. One night, he went around back and laid against the facade of the hotel, only to never wake up. He was found dead the next morning. The story doesn't end there. In the years since Odie nursed his final bottle, folks have felt extreme cold spots in the old room he frequented, even on the hottest days of the summers in western Arizona. Others have claimed they can hear the faint sounds of bagpipes being played from the empty room, while some go as far as to say that the sheets will be torn off the bed even after days of being well kept and untouched. Regardless of which spirit is causing mischief at the Durlin Hotel, rest assured the ghosts of Oatman are not there to scare, but rather play games with the frightened yet fascinated guests. Of course, the same can't be said for all lodging relics dotting the Wild West, with plenty of horrifying haunts still yet to be discovered.
This is the second of our paranormal experiences and images sent in by our viewers. As with all these types of videos, these are genuine incidents, so please be respectful in the comments. Thank you to everyone who sends these in, and now, hit those lights, sit back, and enjoy. Caleb. This next one was sent to us by one of our valued patrons, Caleb. Caleb works for a pest control company as a termite inspector, and most days he and his colleague Paul are required to enter customers' homes, mostly without incident. However, every now and then, weird things happen, and Caleb and Paul, who work separately, often share their experiences throughout the day, communicating through earbuds and messages, and sometimes sending photos if they see something odd. On one occasion, Paul was sent to a house in downtown Mobile, Alabama, and as he walked up to the door, he took a photo and sent it to Caleb. He then asked Caleb, "If you saw what I'm seeing. There's a creepy kid looking at me through the door." Caleb's hands were full, so he didn't look right away, but he heard Paul enter the house and a man greeted him. Paul then asked the customer if anyone else was in the house, which is what they usually ask, so they don't walk in on anyone in the rooms. The man replied, "Nope, just me." He then asked, "You don't have any kids or anything here?" The guy replied, "Nope, just me and my wife live here, and she just left for work." Paul then performed a routine inspection, going into every room, opening every closet, looking behind furniture, going into the attic and crawl space. Throughout the inspection, Paul was muttering to Caleb through headphones and confirmed that there was no one else there. At this point, Caleb looked at the photo Paul had sent him and was shocked to see those two eyes peering through the glass door. It's worth pointing out that when Paul first got out of his truck prior to taking the photo, that face wasn't there, and he said it ran up to the door as he walked towards it. Can dogs see ghosts? Our subscriber Kerry sent us this next video involving the strange behaviour of her dog Meg. Meg only ever went for walks at night, as she seemed to have a fear of hearing children playing and seeing people walking from place to place. But one night, she refused to go any further than the back doorstep. She just stood there growling and barking in a strange way. Carrie was confused as to why she was doing this, although a lot of strange things seemed to happen at the house, such as opening and shutting of cupboard doors, smells of smoke when no one smoked in the house, and loud bangs against doors as if an unseen force had thrown themselves against it. Carrie always believes the activity may have had something to do with her late Granda Lynch, and Meg was barking towards a corner where he used to sit. Take a look at the video. It's obvious that Meg has seen or heard something that Carrie couldn't see.
Where are you going at? Meg? You okay? Right, I'll let you.
Now we know that dogs have a bit of a sixth sense. Is it possible Meg had a brush with the spirit world? or is there a more plausible explanation? Carrie would love to know your thoughts in the comments. Just to point out that the large black thing in the middle of the yard is believed to be a tree. This next true experience was sent to us by a Dega Outlaw, an author and fellow YouTuber who has done work for us in the past. When Adega was 17, he and his friends went fishing one night at Seal Beach, a local harbour in Southern California between Long Beach and Huntington Beach where he grew up. It was late evening when the group left the harbour after catching and cooking fish on the shore. Because Adega was one of 2 drivers, he spent the next hour taking friends home, but later realised he had left some valuable equipment back on the beach, so he returned with his father to retrieve it. The road to the harbour passed through what was called the Miracle Mile. This stretch of road passed through Seal Beach Marine Base, a military munitions depot. The street had very few streetlights, only about one every 300 metres, and the road had a high speed limit of 50 miles per hour. Dead centre on the stretch of road, and exactly between the 2 lights, where it was most dark, Adega's headlights caught a woman standing right in the middle of his lane. He had to swerve immediately to avoid hitting her, but she didn't flinch at all. She just stood there crying dreadfully. Adega was the only car on the road, and there was nothing for a half mile either way. Only high fences and marine bunkers on either side of the road. When he turned around to see if he could assist the woman, she had vanished. There was nothing. She had nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, yet she was gone. Adega believed whatever or whoever it was supernatural. Chris Gonzalez. Chris from Victoria, Texas, sent in this next story from his childhood. When Chris was around 8 or 9 years old, he was living with his grandmother, but sometimes used to stay at his mum and her partner's apartment, along with his brother and sister, but they soon realised there was something very wrong in the apartment. It had a dark presence that all the siblings felt. One night, Chris was talking to his brother and sister through the different bedrooms they were staying in. As they all got tired and started to settle down to sleep, they suddenly heard the sound of the typewriter in the living room. At first they thought it was their mother, until she shouted out, "Who's typing on the typewriter? It's too late." All 3 siblings told her that they were in their rooms, to which their mother said, "Oh my gosh, it's happening again." Apparently it was a regular occurrence, even though no one was in the living room. On another occasion, Chris was in the apartment alone, as everyone was outside having a barbecue, and he had just popped in to use the bathroom when he heard dishes clanking in the kitchen. At first he just thought someone was in the kitchen, but when he went to see who it was, no one was there. He went outside to see if anyone had been in there, and no one had, and his mother told him to stay outside. It seems Chris's mother was experiencing similar things and asked to move apartments as it was getting too much, and eventually they moved to an apartment across the road. However, as the family started moving things out, Chris again found himself alone in the apartment and heard the familiar sound of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. He was still a small boy and was terrified, but mustered up the courage to call out, "Who's there?" There was no answer, just the sound of the dishes getting louder and louder. Chris started to walk slowly towards the kitchen, calling out, "Who's there?" As he got closer to the kitchen, the stacking noise slowed, and as he entered the kitchen, it stopped. There was no one there. But there on the draining board was a pile of neatly stacked dishes. Chris ran out to tell his mother, and she told him to stay out of the apartment, and that this was the reason they were moving. Soon after they moved out, another family moved in, before quickly moving out again. This continued for several years, until eventually the apartment was boarded up and left abandoned, trapping inside whatever was terrifying the families. The Black Figure. This next story and image was sent in by Liam. It was taken by his mum Samantha in 2009, when she went on a school trip to Milner Fields, Bingley, West Yorkshire, in the United Kingdom. Samantha took a photo of some of her students and staff, and in the background, there is what appears to be a woman dressed in black, looking towards the group through the trees. Take a look. Samantha is adamant that there was no one else present at the time of the photo. It was only when she returned to school and was going through the pictures with staff that one of them pointed out the figure. It's worth noting that Samantha was suffering from pneumonia that day, and whilst on the trip had felt like something was following them. This had a chilling significance to us after we looked into the background of Milner Field. Milner Field, it seems, is a cursed place, plagued by tragedy and untimely death. It is the former site of a grand mansion built for Mill Baron Sir Titus Salt, and in its day, it even hosted the future King Edward VII and Princess Beatrice, the youngest daughter of Queen Victoria. But tragedy struck in 1887 with the untimely death of Sir Titus. The Mill Empire and Milner Field passed to Sir James Roberts, but despite the initial success, the curse of Milner Field struck when 3 of his 4 sons died. They were all under the age of 36. The surviving son Harry was severely injured in the First World War and went on to marry the nurse who cared for him, but she died in the global influenza pandemic while pregnant with their child. Sir James's daughter Alice married a decorated war hero, but in 1919 he shot and killed Alice's alleged lover, Major Miles Seaton. He was found guilty of the crime and sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Over the years that followed, there were several more unusual and premature deaths among the families who subsequently lived at Milner Field, and the house became hard to sell or rent due to its ghoulish reputation. The last person to take on the house was Ernest Gates in 1923, but soon after moving in, his wife died, and then 2 years later, he died of blood poisoning after cutting his foot. The final owner, Arthur Remington Hollins, took up residence in 1925. Less than a year later, his wife Anne died of pneumonia, aged 43, and 3 years after, Arthur died on holiday from irritation of the gallbladder. The house was abandoned by 1930 and never inhabited again. In the 1950s, it was demolished. All that is left today are traces of the mosaic floor and the entrances to the cellars. And of course, possibly the ghosts of its tragic past. Is that what was following Samantha? And did she catch it on camera? What do you think? So that's it for this video. We hope you enjoyed, and we'd like to say a special thank you once again to all of the people who send these incredible stories in. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow for another creepy video.